everyone. Welcome back. I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast series by the Havas Medical Anthropology team. We're here to take the BS out of behavioral science by illuminating the why behind the what of behaviors, rituals, and symbols that people take for granted. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires.
So welcome back, everybody. I wanted to introduce our guest for today. Dr. Matt Zakreski is a PsyD, a psychiatric doctorate, with a high-energy professional speaker and a clinical psychologist who specializes in working with the neurodivergent, so gifted, autism, dyslexia, right? Neurodivergence is a fairly new term. We talked about that with the Kathryn Parsons episode, but it covers basically what people think of as non-standard brains, which is already one of the problems with this whole terminology. Dr. Matt can't wait to jump in. He's spoken more than 400 times all over the world on both stages and podcasts about supporting neurodivergent people in all walks of life, from schools to college to the workplace. Dr. Matt specializes in taking knowledge of the brain, human behavior, and clinical psychology and making that accessible and practical for people to improve their lives, which sounds perfect for this podcast. So Dr. Matt, first of all, you reached out to us and asked if you could be on. So I'd just love you to sort of explain how you found us and what motivated you to want to reach out to us and say, look, I'd love to use this platform to sort of explain some things about neurodivergence.
Let's do it. The reason I found your podcast is actually it's a little self-indulgent. So my book comes out in a month and it's called The Neurodiversity Playbook, Cracking the Code of a World Not Built for You. And so I was punching in things like cracking the code, breaking the code, just making sure I wasn't stepping on anybody's broader intellectual footsteps, right? Because I'm not trying to ruffle any feathers here. And you guys showed up at the top of the Google list and I was like, oh, it's a podcast. Click. Oh, you're taking the BS out of behavioral science. That's what I do. I want to talk to them. So
Gabe, all I heard was we showed up on Google.
Yeah, we should feel first. Did you hear that?
I feel like we made it.
SEO, right? So it was a happy accident, but I couldn't be more happy that I'm here with you guys.
It's the happiest of accidents because it's something that we've been diving into quite a bit recently. We started with really talking about just different sort of frames of reference on some of this stuff. And just want to say that the episode with Kathryn Parsons was just so eye-opening for me because I've been around people with various diagnoses on the autism spectrum, especially spent a lot of time with teens on the autism spectrum. Most of them were diagnosed with Asperger's, but I had 6 boys in a Boy Scout troop of 80 who were on the autism spectrum, and they were all different, right? So the Asperger's diagnosis, first of all, didn't help too much. It helped a little bit to know that they were not going to be able to see things in shades of gray, that they were going to be very absolute about things. But after that, it was like just a scatter graph of personalities, as you'd expect, right? They're people, they're teenage boys. They had different skill sets, interests, abilities, personalities, senses of humor, and they all sort of played out very differently. And that was my first experience with, okay, they do all seem to have something in common, but they also seem to be quite different. Why did we lump them together? So, the flip of that deficit model is the giftedness, right? You can't have failure without success. You can't have A's without F's. It's something that educators have talked about for a long time. Why did we create a system where we imply that certain people are going to fail anyway?
That's the perfect place to start. If we start with the idea of public education, right? Public education is built under this idea of FAPE, right? Free access for public education. It's got to be, we want everyone to have access to this. Now, we know that 68% of people are in the first standard deviation of the IQ distribution, right? So 68% of humans have IQs between 85 and 115. And 80% of people are neurotypical, right? So those numbers largely go together. What this means for our conversation is we built the world around the most people, which is a very logical thing to do, right? And for many years, the idea with teaching is teach to the middle, right? Support the kids on the low end and let the kids on the upper end do their own thing, right? But as we learn more about education and mental health, we realize that those things are well-intentioned, but not enough, right? And the way I usually frame this, right? So Gabe, can I use you as an example? Do you mind?
Go for it.
So Gabe, if you were having a dinner party, you're having all the gang over, right? what would you cook for everybody coming to your house for dinner?
Gabe doesn't cook.
Let's say chicken. I make chicken for my family, so let's say chicken.
Love it. Chicken, easy, straightforward, right? And so I'm like, cool, you're making chicken for everybody. And then Brad's like, oh, by the way, my niece's partner is coming and they're vegan. Now you're going to throw all that chicken in the garbage?
No, but we may get something else for the vegan.
There it is, my friend, right? So that's the thing. Forever, the educational model was, well, if they're not going to have chicken, they can just eat sides. But that's not good enough. I don't want you to eat the string beans and the baked potatoes. Yes, those things are vegan, but like maybe you want your own entree. So I'm going to also offer an entree that a vegan can eat because that is what they do. That's equity, right? Equity is everybody gets what they need. So for those of us who advocate for neurodivergent learners, we're not saying throw away your chicken. We're not saying don't have the dinner party. We're just saying, please make sure that you've got entrees for everybody. And that's why I use like this dinner party metaphor, because everybody's had people over for dinner.
I mean, I guess a question I have, right, is in terms of that metaphor of like what people eat and everything. Pescatarian is a personal choice, whether or not like you were raised that way or you're in a religion where you become a vegan or something. At some point, you become old enough to make your own choices and go like, I love pepperoni pizza and I don't care that I'm kosher, right? Like I'm fruit of the pig. That's what a friend of mine calls it. He's like, I make one mistake all the time and it's pepperoni pizza. You're old enough to make your choices. We're tagging children, quite literally. TAG, Talented and Gifted, was the program I was pulled out into for a while, and it was pointless. It was useless. Like I wish I hadn't been pulled out, right? It marks you as kind of a weirdo in second grade. You're already probably a weirdo in second grade, right? If you're sort of in a certain mode. But also like it's sort of a predestination thing. And I know there are endless studies about like expectations are met kind of thing. Like what was George Bush's comment, the soft tyranny of low expectations kind of thing, that if you start getting put into tracks, however you got there, if you're in track 2 or track 3, you're never going to catch up to track 1. Somebody when you were 10 years old said you're not good for trigonometry and you will not be given trigonometry. I pointed out that whole like assume I can, hey bartender ad with the woman with Down syndrome. That there is an educational corollary there that is 100% like, if you don't show me trig, you'll never find out if I could have done trig. And we find ourselves tagging people as gifted who are easy to get along with, whose parents have a lot of resources or who come from a background where books are something that, are all over the house. No, I'm not giving a moral judgment to that. I'm saying, there are homes with fewer books, not because they're bad people, but because they just don't have a lot of books lying around. And there's an absolute correlation between early literacy and the number of books in your home and whether or not your parents read to you and things like that. That doesn't mean that child who hasn't been read to couldn't become gifted, but we so quickly put this idea that the smart kids belong together and the less smart kids belong together and the different kids belong together. And that flies in the face of the world we then enter when we leave, which is everybody's sort of on the same train car. That's my biggest problem with this whole frame of reference of gifted, not gifted, neurodivergent. I mean, I get it, and I get we're trying to organize public education, but what's the fundamental, basis of that thinking?
And I mean, we could honestly spend the rest of the podcast on that sentence, right? Which is really cool. So a lot of gifted education in this country is done poorly because it's underfunded and it's misunderstood, right? So I'll share with you my gifted journey, and I think it will illuminate what we're talking about. So when I was in second grade, they sent us home with a math workbook. We had to do pages 1 through 4 in the math workbook. I did pages 1 through 4, and I was like, well, okay, that wasn't so hard. I'll just finish the workbook, right? So I just did the rest of the workbook. I brought it back in the next day, and my teacher was like, who helped you with this? I'm like, nobody helped me with this. They're like, go to the principal's office. Right. And I got in trouble. And my parents were like, oh, we're pretty sure he's gifted. Here's why we think that. And, then they sent me back to math class, and Miss Vaughn gave me another math workbook. And even as an 8-year-old, I was like, well, hold up, because I just showed you I could do this. Why are you giving me more of the same thing? Right. When I talk to people about their gifted education programs, it's like, Well, they pulled us into a room once in a while and we played with Legos. Or they pulled us into a room once in a while and they gave us brain teasers. It wasn't deeper or richer education. It wasn't more meaningful. It wasn't faster. It wasn't compacted in a meaningful
No, I'll
way.
tell you mine. I mean, it was very similar where we got pulled out every once in a while and they were like, okay, come up with a project. And I'm like, I'm in third grade. I can barely organize a project now, right?
Yeah.
So in retrospect now, what was interesting was how little they thought we needed to learn things like project management. They were just like, oh, you're gifted. You'll come up with a project and it'll be interesting. And I'm like, I'm 10 or 11 years old. Like we just, messed around. I was looking for the right word there. Messed around with like blocks a little bit. And then we were sent back to whatever, we had missed. And the major impact was people knew you were leaving class for talented and gifted. You didn't learn anything during it. And you came back and they were like, oh, here's the gifted kids. And then, like exactly. Right, exactly. And which is fine. I mean, you get used to that too. There's a lot to this idea of neurodivergence. Just the frame that like we're all slightly different does demean the experience of people who have kids who sort of say fall outside the developmental norms of, say, language milestones, right? You have a child who doesn't speak. Kathryn talked about that. It was terrifying for her parents. And they engaged in what we would think of as very unkind strategies to get her to talk. But even she said, like, they didn't know what they were doing. And they just felt like they needed me to talk to survive in the world. They were terrified I wouldn't make it in the world, So, I mean, talk a little about this deficit model and this idea of like, non-normed children are everywhere, but some of them need more than others. How do we even address that?
Well, and when I was in grad school and I started to untangle the research on here and realized the questions I was asking are similar to yours, they are big. And I said to my mentor, Dr. Jackie Zaraba, and I said, Jackie, I don't know if I can do this because if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to change everything. And she looked me dead in the eye. She said, yep.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, damn it, right?
So when you say everything, like, what do you mean by everything, right? We're both educators, so it's probably a little more self-evident, right? I've taught a long time, so have you. What do we mean by change everything when we say, like, if we're really going to take this sort of like at face value, everybody's different kind of approach?
The three best things this country does are national parks, public libraries, and public education. And I'm not rank ordering them. They're just the three best things this country does, right? And the problem with public education is that it is built off an antiquated model of learning and a kid's role in society. And we know, and what we see more and more is that you are trying to cram increasingly round kids through increasingly square holes, right? And so what we see, and the research shows this in education, in mental health, in workplace fit, in medical health, the best practices in special education are just the best practices, full stop.
Right.
Meeting kids where they are, interest-based learning, differentiation, acceleration when they're ready, right? This idea of because you're 9 years old, but you're 9 years old on this side of September 1st, you are going to go to school with these kids and learn these things in this way. I mean, it's a conveyor belt, right? It's Henry Ford and the
we've become very efficient in some ways at public education, although the people in my town who argue over the budget every year would say we've become inefficient. But right. Schooling, this is something Gabe and I talk about a lot. Schools reflect the values of the society that create those schools. So if you have mandatory public education, it's because we believe as a society that it's important for children to go to school. We didn't used to, right? We did not used to. And I talk to Gabe all the time, like historically and not that long ago, children were just useless adults, and we were just waiting for them to occupy workspace to actually be able to do their thing, which is why you sort of grade up their chores and stuff, and why we give summers off so you can help with harvest and all that stuff. Now it's like children are this untapped potential that we can ruin or mold or prime if we give them the right sort of inputs. And that is a wildly different mental model of what children are. And I think some of it has to do with the fact that, half of them don't die in infancy anymore and things like that. I mean, we really are only talking 100 years ago, right? That like infant mortality was vast. I think it's taken a while for us to come up to that, but this idea of like childhood as milestones and childhood as activating potential, and a childhood deprived of activations is a childhood that leaves you dumb for the rest of your life. Big air quotes around dumb. That's all very modern ideas of public education. And this idea that, inherently somebody is smarter than someone else, that comes really out of like a caste view of the world. Like the lawyers are lawyers because they're smarter, and it runs in families because smart runs in families. Not, did it ever occur to you that the farmers are farmers because their dads and moms were farmers? But everybody thinks of this as the result of natural selection. It's not. It's the result of cultural patterns of education and familiarity and access. So that's a long, long, long statement or question in the form of a statement, really. But like, the purpose of public education is being questioned now. And some of what we took for granted about things like, well, people with Down syndrome are never going to be successful, is because we've seen that like they can be, and that everybody has right to exist in public. We don't lock people away the way we used to. It's the easiest way of dealing with uncomfortable people is lock them up, and then you don't have to think about them, right? Look at Russia and Navalny. We did that with people who are neurodivergent on a lot of ways. And Kathryn said, if I had not lobbied for myself, if I had let my parents do what they wanted to do, I'd be living in assisted living right now. So we're sort of grappling with the public life, the sharing of public spaces with people that we used to conveniently sort of lock away.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And then we're turning around to the education system going like, prepare everyone. And this is not what public school teachers are trained in for the most part. So, I mean, the whole thing is, to your point, it's a reset. Where would we even start? How do we create this sort of intellectual meritocracy, this neuro meritocracy, to go along with neurodivergence as a concept? Is that even possible?
And let me just jump in first and add like the flip side of it too, where we have this conversation about giftedness, and there's this expectation on the other side of people in society. They're smart, they can handle everything. Dr. Matt, you were bringing up the example earlier, how teachers teach to the middle and leave the gifted kids to themselves. My personal experience, we're sharing our gifted stories. I was also gifted from actually kindergarten to 8th grade, I believe. And so it was like a lot of my early, life, basically. And one of the things when I got out of that system and went into more general education was kids would come up to me and say, Gabriel, I wish I had your brain, and it's like, is it just you wish you did as well as me in education? Is it, the way I talk? Because there are other aspects of it. There's other pressures of it too. And even like internally, as we to shift the conversation, is like gifted individuals, the pressure on themselves to succeed and the isolation and things like that too. So when we talk about like neuromeritocracy, I'd like you to speak to both aspects of it as well when we talk about neurodivergence as a spectrum.
And do I think these changes can be made? I wouldn't do my job if I didn't, right? I mean, one of the talks I give a lot is called it's all about hope, right? And the paradox of hope is that you have to acknowledge that you're not where you want to be in order to have hope to get to where you want to be in the future, right? I don't have the job I want. I hope I will get the job I want, right? We don't have the infrastructure to support the changes to education that need to happen. But I hope that that's happening, because I talk to educators all over this country, and there is a groundswell movement that they know that the tools they were given are no longer fit for the jobs they have.
Right.
Right.
Were they ever?
And, I mean, that would probably not. And, and both of you have spoken to the aspect of intersectionality here, right?
Right.
Class systems, socioeconomic development, race and gender and ethnicity. A couple of years ago, I got to consult to the Philadelphia school district, and I was asking them, they were showing me their data on their gifted kids. And I was okay, so if the Philadelphia school system serves 200,000 kids, I'm making up the numbers because I don't remember.
Let's keep them round though, right? Like
round is good. We like round, right?
Yeah.
And we know gifted is the top 2% of the population, right? So we're talking, if you serve 200,000 kids, you should have 4,000 gifted students, right? And when they crunched the numbers, they were like, gosh, we don't have 4,000 gifted kids. We have 1,800 gifted kids. And I'm like, right. And the 2,200 kids you're missing that the numbers say should exist because it's a normal distribution, I guarantee you those are the Black and brown kids. I
Yeah.
guarantee you the kids from the poor parts of Philly, from Strawberry Hill, right, from Kensington, right? We know these kids exist and we know their brains are out there, right? But the model is set up to catch and to seek out and catch kids that look and act a certain way, largely kids who look like me, right? Upper middle class white boy whose parents are both doctors, who toddled into his upper middle class public school and goes, "Hi, I'm really smart." And they're like, "You sure are, son. Pat, pat." And they send me off to the gifted classroom to build Legos, right?
We talked about this on the SAT episode. Like, the SAT is a reflection, is a predictor of how you will do in college, in part because to do well on the SATs, you have to understand a lot of other stuff about how college ends up working. Right. So it's a good litmus, but it's not what people think it is, which is this sort of like test of your brain. It's like, it's a test of your brain and your training and your worldview and your experience. And, it's how you can do 7 years of A+ French and not know how to order a cup of coffee when you get to Paris. We teach you things we can test you on so that we can grade you and give A's, B's, C's, and D's. We can't grade communicative competence very easily, so we don't bother testing it, nor teaching it. We just teach vocabulary lists. That is the most circular logic, right? We need to be able to give A's, so we teach things that we can grade easily.
Yep.
That seem like we're teaching language, but actually all you've done is learn a vocabulary list, which has nothing to do with how people learn language in use. That is a good metaphor for a lot of what we value in early education, is the ability to theoretically understand things. That doesn't necessarily translate into success later in life. It just makes you a good theoretician. And we end up with a lot of doctors who are good test takers and good short-term memory guys and girls who don't, say, have empathy for exactly this reason. And there are consequences to the way that we run educational programs. And it gets back to this notion of gifted and not gifted. Bonus implies deficit, that sort of thing. Those 2,200 black and brown kids that you mentioned who aren't being seen in Philly, they're also not being provided the opportunity to see a world beyond where they started. Yeah. And the expectation is that that's okay.
And if it's not okay, it's acceptable.
That's
right?
what I mean. Sorry. Yeah. I don't mean to imply I think it's okay. I'm like, everybody is aware of it and they're like, yeah, that'll happen. Right. Like, oh, there's no books at this kid's house. Let's pay for the public library. It's like, no one really uses the public library anymore.
I mean, the elephant in the room in all of these conversations is privilege. I mean, I went to Wake Forest University, which is a very good school. And I grew up in Rumson and Fairhaven, which is in Monmouth County, New Jersey, some of the most affluent towns in the country. And I had a teacher once slip up in class and say about a kid who just sort of managed to keep failing upward into the honors and AP classes. And she was saying out loud, she was like, that kid was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple.
Yeah, 100%.
Myself, like, that's, I mean, that, like, one of those moments you're like, it'd be like that. Like, right now, listen, I cannot deny the privilege I have, and that's why I try to build a bigger table, not a higher fence, right? But that's the thing. I mean, it's the educational equivalent of missing white girl syndrome, right? Like if we are missing the white kids who are gifted, then we have to find them. Well, what about the black and brown kids? What about the kids in wheelchairs? What about the kids in single parent homes? Society, man. What are we supposed to do? Like,
getting back to this notion of gifted as well, like, gifted how? I think one of the things that we've really changed in the linguistic side of things about what, quote, AI, end quote, because the original idea of artificial intelligence was, can we create a general problem solving machine that thinks like a human brain? And now we've realized, no, but we can do a lot of statistical stuff that makes it possible to beat humans at specific tasks. So the machine that won in chess is not the machine that won in Go, is not the machine that looks for liver abnormalities and vast things, right? Like, AI is very specific, in other words. And sometimes I think we call people gifted when they spike along one axis. They do wonderfully in math. Two of the children, the young men who were in my Boy Scout troop who had Asperger's, went on to get engineering degrees. They were not good with people. That's all I can say. I won't tell the stories, right? But you could see that just it was very, very tiring for them. It was very confusing for them. It was very frustrating for them to try and navigate human sort of to human interactions. They were much more comfortable with numbers and math. I remember thinking we were doing a terrible disservice every summer camp by saying, pick the person you're going to tent with. Because what happens is there's this frenzy, and all of a sudden when the dust settles, there's 6 kids left who haven't picked a tent mate because they're incapable of navigating that sort of rugby scrum of finding a tent mate. And then they all just end up tenting together every single summer. And that part seemed cruel to me, but also like inevitable, right? Like they were smart, but they were not going to be able to navigate a mob scene like that and find someone that they wanted to tent with. They were going to be leftovers. And I think there's this weird sort of dichotomy of like you're both leftover and gifted, and neither one of these things is true. You're just better at some things than others, you know?
And just to add on that, it makes me think about when we say gifted, what aspects of it are like as a larger society, neurotypical and neurodivergent, what aspects stick out the most? When we talk about the semantics of being gifted, it's just smart. And so I wish I was gifted. I wish so and so was gifted, but we won't talk about the story about the 6 kids who have to go in the TED because they can't navigate social situations on their own. That's still gifted. Like it's all a part of one experience. It's all in one tent. You are acing the math test, but you also cannot ask the girl out to prom. You just can't.
Yes, right. And oh my gosh, you nailed it, because gifted is so much more than smart. And that was the dynamic I grew up with. You're smart, you're going to go to Harvard someday, good for you. We expect you to get straight A's and all the things. And nobody told me about the emotionality, right? Gifted people, to use one example of neurodivergence, right? Their amygdala, the source of fight or flight emotions in their brain, can be up to twice as large as a neurotypical person.
Wow.
Their prefrontal cortex takes about another 5 to 10 years to fully develop when compared to a neurotypical person. This is where the idea, and Brad, I'm sure you've seen this, the absent-minded professor, right? The person who shows up who can do the lecture on language theory but forgot the textbooks, right? The person, how many times have I been in a classroom whereas you've got a brilliant person, light of their field, who's like, how do I turn Zoom on? Is there a button? Right? So I consulted to a district in a school in Virginia once where they had 78% of the 4th grade class was in the gifted program. And I looked at their leadership team. I was like, this is egregious. Like, these parents have the old, antiquated, broken version of gifted, which gifted means smart. Smart means you're going to Harvard. I want my kid to be in the gifted program because it's a leg up. And what we know now, and that's why I go on podcasts and do talks, is that gifted education is special education, not because these kids are better, but because they learn differently. They require more depth. They need and require fewer repetitions to learn the thing, right? If your average student takes 50 repetitions to learn a math problem, a gifted kid might take 6. So I would argue that making that kid do 44 math problems that they don't need to do, they have shown they can do the thing,
right,
is inequitable, right?
This is where Lave and Wenger and that whole like communities of practice. How can we? So now I'm going like deep cut stuff, but I still think it's very relevant, because I think in, for example, graduate school, we shift to that model, right? So just to sort of the 30-second version of this, if you were raised in the 70s, you will have come across something called project learning, which they shoved onto teachers without any support. And they were like, we need to come up with a project. The idea came really out of this other idea that these 2 sociologists, Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger, were wondering, A's imply F's, for lack of a stronger, we don't need to go too deep into this, right? But like if people are gifted, then people are ungifted by corollary. And that doesn't seem like a good way of approaching mandatory, compulsory, comprehensive public education. Why would we force kids to go to school when we know a certain percentage of them are going to fail by design? How can we create a system where everybody graduates? And they said, honestly, the closest thing we can have is an apprenticeship model where if Gabe and Dr. Matt are both apprentice tailors, The assumption is they'll both become full-fledged tailors. Gabriel might be more talented with sewing by hand, and Dr. Matt might have a better eye for how cloth drapes on people and will sort of move them along, but they're going to get there, right? So Gabe moves on from hand sewing faster than Dr. Matt because he's not as coordinated as Gabe. Sorry, Dr. Matt. But he'll get there, right? And when he's ready, he moves on. That's very different than, say, the experience in my family where one of my children as a teenage boy didn't do as well in math in 6th grade as he might have, which is utterly predictable. And that tracked him out of the top math classes for the rest of his high school career. Yeah. And there was no mechanism by which he could catch back up. And so there was no sense of this apprenticeship model of like, it just took Dr. Matt a little longer than to learn how to hand sew, but actually Dr. Matt is going to be the better designer because he understands fabric. Dr. Matt won't get that chance. He's already been tracked into the Sewing for Dummies class. And that is the problem of tracking, and that is also the problem that was trying to be addressed by this communities of practice thing. So for us, in a work environment, in a graduate school environment, especially like the kind of doctorates that we did, like it's when you're ready. It could take 5 years, it could take 10 years. They may have decided you don't have the skill set you need. One of the things that corporate America also struggles with is people who are excellent along one axis, but not all of them.
Yes.
So I think it's a metaphor and a model that actually has implications all the way through life. We're sort of circling around this idea that like neurodivergence might be the solution. It's all part of God's great mosaic, as they say. That does take away from the reality that some of these children do need a lot more resources, right? They need a lot more human resources, if nothing else, right? So,
and one of the things we know, and this blew my mind when I dug into the research on this, right? We can trace neurodivergence back to a really like a biodevelopmental model, right? So to simplify, let's say that you get 100 developmental energy, right? When you're growing up, when you're a fetus, and you get 100 developmental energy, and that gets cut into 5 pie pieces: intelligence, academic skills, social skills, emotional skills, and physical skills. And a neurotypical person largely has 20, 20, 20, 20 all around the board. You might have like 22, 18, but like it's large.
Sorry, I just got to ask, is that true? Is the average, like you pull a guy out of a subway car or a girl out of a subway car, they're going to be like within one standard deviation on every one of those 5 axes?
That's the idea. I mean, that's what neurotypical is. Neurotypical is a brain that functions largely as we would expect it to, with minimal deviation vis-a-vis that idea of a standard deviation, right? You might have a neurotypical person who is a little bit smarter and a little bit more social and a little less emotionally intelligent, but those things are within that normal band, right? Normal human, I'm 6 feet tall, right? I'm on the upper end of average for men in this country, right?
Right.
And my neighbor, who is 5'11", and he tells me this all the time. He's like, "Why are you an inch taller than me?" I'm like, "Why do you care?" He is also average, though he is demonstrably shorter than me, right?
Right.
So that's typical, right? In neurodivergent kids, that developmental process becomes asynchronous. It goes out of sync. So you might get 40 developmental energy for intellect, 10 for social, 10 for emotional, 15 for physical, and the rest for academic. Right. So that is why these kids end up so different, why they end up not being able to navigate the rugby scrum to who I'm going to bunk with. I mean, right. And it's one, as adults, the adults I work with, they are smart enough to get the jobs. They're not capable enough to keep them. Right. The most amazing electrical engineer I've ever met, and she is a bright and spectacular human. Now she's tenure track, but she went back to academia because of this situation. She worked for Pico, which is the big electrical company in Philly, and her boss called me and she's like, "I know I can't talk to you about her treatment. However, if we don't find a better way to solve it, I'm going to lose my mind." Like, she's just an unpleasant person. She's grating. She is weak social skills. She doesn't do the same personal hygiene things that other people do for reasons. And it's the sort of thing. She is pound for pound the smartest person in the room, But the last person somebody in the room would put up for promotion, last person you asked for happy hour. When people got hurt in the Secret Santa at Christmas, they would burst into tears. That's a true story. So if we are just treating gifted as smart and do what we in the gifted field used to call the eminence model, our job is to make the gifted kids eminent in physics, chemistry, electrical engineering, literature. You should be president of something. Now we want well-rounded kids who have life satisfaction. If you want to be the best veterinarian in Dallas, Texas, do it. If you want to write children's pop-up books in Cleveland, do it. If you want to be a stay-at-home parent in Palo Alto, do it. Right? That's the thing. There's no inherent worth to some things as compared to others, which is not how we used to do this. If we go back to that kid who has that developmental asynchrony, more intellectual academic horsepower than social emotional skills, that's a kid that now, in the goal of treating this person as a well-rounded three-dimensional human, we need to not only identify their social emotional needs, but treat them, to manage them, to give them the skills. And getting back to what Brad said before, like, you know, as we've gotten tracked onto this track model, No Child Left Behind, the inherent cost of that was the community aspect of education. You know, recess time in this country has decreased 57% in the last 10 years. Kids don't have time.
Insane, by the way.
Insane, right? And kids don't have passing time in the hallways anymore. They don't have, we're losing lunch, we're losing art, we're losing home ec, we're losing gym, we're losing music. Those are the soft skills classes. Those are the subjective classes where kids were pushed to develop the social emotional skills. Why do we have this crisis of SEL right now? A, because COVID.
Can we just SEL, social emotional learning?
Social emotional learning, right? But also we've taken away the times and spaces where these kids had to learn to be around each other. So weirdly, those broader societal trends are bringing neurodivergence to the forefront, because now it's much more normal to teach social skills in school. My daughter, she's 6. They have SEL every week. It's just a thing they do. Like, we would have taken home ec or shop, right? And bring back home ec, bring back shop. Like, I want those classes back in, because those are the things that are making the kid well-rounded, not just the old model of gifted, which is how many AP classes can you get before you leave? That's dumb.
Right.
It's not serving our kids.
Right, a volume of intellectual effort, right? It's interesting because that's part of why I became so enamored of Boy Scouts. I was not a Boy Scout as a child. I was taking camping quite a bit, and I thought it was an easy way to figure out how to take my boys camping, and then took my daughter camping through Girl Scouts. But a lot of the adults who were very committed to Boy Scouts pointed out that, like, it's the only place left where, for example, mixed ages hang out together. That things are so age stratified that growing up in the 70s, just in the 70s, you would hang out with older brothers and older sisters and their friends, and your parents are sort of off doing their thing. And like, the most normal thing in the world is to have mixed age groups sort of hanging around. Now, you know, you want to have some oversight. 17-year-olds can be very cruel to 12-year-olds, and you need to step in. You don't want to go full feral. Let's not go back to, you know, the 70s neglect. But this idea that, like, they were outdoors. They were engaging with the woods. They were engaging in problem solving together. We do a lot of stuff like, hey, let's build a boat. And what was interesting was the engineer, the smartest of the children, and air quotes, but clearly the most gifted when it came to science and math, possibly of all of them, out of all those 80 boys, ended up getting them to listen to him one time in the regatta, quote, and it was a silly regatta that we would do. You had to build a boat, and it worked, and the boat worked, and the kid was so happy. And when they got back to our section of the camp after having won the boat regatta, he said, I hope you all learned your lesson and you never doubt me again. And I slapped my hand to my face and went, oh dear, whatever goodwill you've managed to build up by making a boat that won, you have just erased. Like, but it was, you know, it was still interesting to watch him have this success that would have been impossible had we not had him in Boy Scouts. And it took some effort to keep him in Boy Scouts. We had a hard time keeping him safe. He'd get frustrated and he'd wander off. He was the most frustratable as well, right? And we're like, we can't have a kid wandering off into the woods. The solution was not to throw him out. The solution was to say to his parents, we really need you to be a minder for him on these campouts until he gets with the program. We are not trained for this. We are not staffed for this. He is a good scout. We are more than welcome to have him here, and we will make sure the boys accept him. But you got to keep him safe when the lights go out. Like, one of you has to be here. And you know what? They did it. And 2 years later, they stopped having to come because he figured out what the parameters were. So there are always ways of making room for people who are difficult. And the nice thing about Boy Scouts was being efficient and making some stupid boat was not the goal. Right. The goal was them working together and learning how to do a project together. And I've noticed all the boys who went straight through Boy Scouts, even the ones who didn't make Eagle, right, but who sort of stuck with it through to the end, they understand projects and they understand how to get the most out of other people. That is something we don't teach at all in public schools anymore.
And I mean, and you nailed it. And that's why you're seeing these new model education systems that are grouping kids not just on ability, but also on interest, right? And funny how some parts of our society allow for that, right? Shirley Temple was the youngest person to win an Academy Award. Do you know how old she was when she won the Academy Award?
5.
6, right?
Okay.
And in a traditionally stratified society, like, you're not old enough to be an actor. Who the hell says? Right. You've got the Olympics this summer. I think the average age of the skateboarder gold medalist, the medalist, was like 15. If you are the best at the thing you do, you go to chart. That's what it is. That is bureaucracy, right? And that means they're competing against 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds. I've got music kids who are second chair in their city's orchestra, not the youth orchestra, the grown-up adult orchestra. In car, they get dropped off by their mom, right? That's the level where that kid needs to be. But we don't treat these kids like monoliths, right? If you're an amazing flute player, because flautist is fun to say.
Flautist is fun to say.
It is fun to say. You might not be great at chemistry. You might not be able to catch a ball. You might not be able to paint your way out of a paper bag. But the gift of asynchrony is meeting kids where they are in as many different areas as we need to meet them, right? And we call this in the gifted world, the shorthand is the rule of 5, because every gifted kid is 5 kids. You have a developmental age, an academic age, an intellectual age, a social age, and an emotional age. And to truly properly intervene with that kid, you've got to meet them in all those places. So you might have those mixed peer groups because this kid is playing chess against adults, but in social skills programs for kids who are a little bit younger than them, because that's where their social skills are.
So you just mentioned 2 of the other boys who were in the Boy Scout troop, right? Like, so it's fascinating.
It was there the whole time.
I would say those 5 elements are really interesting. And again, a society's educational system is a reflection of the values of the society. Literacy is a reflection of what the society values. So my understanding is Muslim countries, literacy is seen as the ability to read the Quran. Whereas in the United States, literacy is measured by whether or not you can read a bus schedule, right? It's very functional. It's very work-oriented in some ways. Like, can you get to your job on time? And so, those sorts of things that we take for granted, or they're implicit, right? Like, of course, school is for getting A's on tests. It's like, is it? Is it for introducing people to possible future jobs? Is it teaching people how to get along with people who are different from them? Is it to give them, a sports scholarship? You talk to 10 parents, especially in Monmouth County. I played rugby down there, right? Like Monmouth Maulers. Like, Monmouth is somewhere where, I won't say who, but I was in a sports league discussion and I said, a lot of my kids from up here in the lower Hudson Valley, they come from families that don't go to college. And if they want to continue in this collegiate in rugby, the collegiate pathway doesn't exist. Can we sort of associate ourselves with a community college? And the guy from Westchester went, my parents would be in open rebellion if they thought that their child was going to go to community college to play rugby. And I said, your children don't need a hand to college. They're going to Ivies and you're paying. Like, what are you talking about? Like, it is interesting what the solutions to education seem to show as values of the current culture. And those are shifting, right? So we've had you on for a really long time. And I just want to say it's been fascinating. We could definitely have you back on. We may have a panel on this. I would love to. Dr. Matt, we are going to put a link to your book in the chat. We will certainly have you on again. This has been fascinating. I love it. So, Gabriel, any final questions? I just know we're up against time and we promised Dr. Matt we wouldn't keep him too long.
This has been really special for me personally, just because, as a gifted kid growing up, now entering adulthood, the question that I posed before we started recording, but it's like, what do I do with my giftedness, quote unquote, now?
Well, you come work for Havas Medical Anthropology, Gabe, and you run a podcast.
Well, of course. And so I really feel like this is a really valuable conversation, both, to have out there and then also just for me personally. So, Dr. Matt, thank you. And I know we are coming on a minute left, so I just want to give you the floor. If there's any last thing that you wanted to say, anything you wanted to plug, where our listeners could reach you, give you the floor now.
I just got to say the nerdiest thing, and then I'll give Matt the floor, right? When he was talking about like this kid is good at this and not good at this, all I could think is Dungeons and Dragons. And like this kid rolled an 18 for intelligence and a 4 for personality or something like, and Dr. Matt's giving me snaps. And that is the nerdiest, most like ex-gifted child thing. Yeah, go ahead. Man.
You want to talk about societal shifts. I mean, as a teen, right, 14, 15, 16, I was friends with really nerdy people because I'm a nerd. And we would play Dungeons and Dragons. And I mean, I would tell you this, I would have sold my own mother up the river if anybody had found out about it. I was more open about like the porn I read, like than I was like about like, no one can know I play Dungeons and Dragons. No one can know I read comic books. And now
right.
There's like traveling shows and there's famous podcasts about, Will Wheaton's tabletop podcast is amazing. Right. And it's so different and it reflects. Yes, right. I mean, all of this has this like the lingering specter of capitalism floating over it, right? How utilitarian are you? How much value do you have? But it's a good thing to wrap up on this is that you can play Dungeons and Dragons to be good at it. You can play Dungeons and Dragons to find community. You can find Dungeons and Dragons to build social skills. But society doesn't get to dictate the value you take from that. Right. I didn't go to Gifted Summer Camp because I wanted to go to Harvard. I went to Gifted Summer Camp because I wanted to find my people. And I called my mom on the first day and I said, I don't have to pretend to be dumb here. That was a foundational moment in my life. In many ways, the reason I do what I do now is that if you're listening out there, the things that make your soul light up, the things that bring you joy, the things you could talk about till 4 a.m. with your friends, those are the things that you want to add to turn up the volume on in your life. If you can center them, awesome. If you can't, make sure you carve out room because you may not be able to quit your job as an accountant, right? But if the thing that makes you happier than anything else is shooting arrows, then you make sure you join the local archery club too. And that's how...
Choose your joy, babe. Choose your joy.
And that's the inherent melding of mental health, education, right, and psychological development into creating that well-rounded 3-dimensional person, which I think is why we all do what we do, right? It's not just, to use your point from before, Brad, it's not just, I know every word in French. It's, I can go to France, order a coffee, sit with my friend, and have a good time. And that's the dream. And we are now moving finally in that direction. So
one hopes from your mouth to God's ears, as my grandma used to say. So, and with that, I am Brad Davidson. This is Breaking the Code on behalf of Gabriel Allen Cummings, Dr. Matt, and myself. Thanks for listening. And we're going to go set up a new dungeon to play, I think, the 3 of us.
Oh, nice.
Thanks, everybody. Breaking the Code is a podcast created by the Havas Medical Anthropology Group. Hosted by Brad Davidson and Sanika Garcia. Content and post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration from all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Please leave a rating, subscribe, and send us a message to our mailbox at medicalanthropology@havas.com. Until next time.